Thank you, Mark, and thanks everyone for coming out. I'm looking forward to the discussion with our panelists, but before we start, I would like to introduce Zach Henenfent, who is going to be describing his commitment to action called Community Currency. Zach, do you want to come up?
Hi, my name is Zach Henenfent, and I'm from Northwestern University right outside of Chicago. My partners and I started our nonprofit, Community Currency Corporation, in 2016. Our goal is to collect leftover foreign currency from travelers at O'Hare Airport, exchange them for US currency, and donate the funds to support summer camp programming through the Chicago Boys and Girls Clubs. Exchanging leftover foreign currency can be time-consuming, expensive, and not worthwhile. Many exchangers will not even accept coins. The total of lost money as a result of leftover currency has been estimated to be as much as $1.5 billion annually in the US. The summer programming at the Boys and Girls Clubs of Chicago addresses the problem of summer learning loss, particularly in minority and low-income students. During those 2 months off, as much as 1 month of school year achievement can be lost. Declines are especially sharp in math across all socioeconomic groups, and income-based reading gaps are seen to widen. The Boys and Girls Club programs seek to combat summer slide by engaging kids in creative expression, collaborative group projects, and discovery activities. Summer camp is designed to be both fun and offer educational activities. We have formed a partnership with the Boys and Girls Clubs of Chicago and are contributing funds that are helping them provide free summer camp for all families. A partnership with Northwestern University and Loyola University Chicago has allowed us to place donation boxes in their study abroad offices. We have had coin drives at several area schools and finalized the design for the donation receptacles at O'Hare. We have raised over $20,000 to produce the receptacles. Going forward, we seek to scale our program to other major airports and support Boys and Girls Clubs in those cities. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. I'd like to introduce our panel now. We have Anne Filipic from the Obama Foundation, where she's the Chief Program Officer, Mayra Jimenez, who's the Children's Program Director and Managing Attorney for RAICES, Jamila Raqib, who's the Executive Director of the Albert Einstein Institution, and Justin Luke Riley, who's the founder and CEO of Young People in Recovery. Always a bit of a musical chairs. So when we were in the green room, we were talking about why are we here and why scaling matters and how are we going to reach 2 billion people with certain kinds of services and interventions ranging from education and health to financial services, and we thought, well, scaling was an important part of doing that. So that's one theme that we're going to talk about today. But I wanted to start with you, Mayra. Your agency is on the front lines of immigration issues that we face as a nation. And I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about how your staff has adopted to policy changes related to these immigration issues, including a reduction in funding, increased caseload, high media attention, and maybe an overall environment that's generally unfriendly to many of the people and beneficiaries that you're seeking to help.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Immigration law is an unpredictable environment to be in. It can literally change every day. A case can be issued, an executive order can be signed that completely changes all our current cases and how we proceed. It's probably one of the best and worst things about it. It definitely keeps you on your toes. It's not boring, but it can also be really exhausting. It's always been this way. I work for an agency that's been around for 30 years, and despite so much policy changes, and believe me, regardless of the administration, these issues have always been this volatile. It's really important to be able to adapt to these changes and not see them as hindering your agency, but as a way for opportunity and growth. For example, when President Obama issued DACA, a way for immigrant youth to potentially have a status here and have a worker's authorization, we developed a program as a result of that to help this immigrant youth to apply for this. When we networked and to get some scholarships available for those who couldn't apply for it. After this summer, we now have a program dedicated to reuniting families that have been separated at the border. Regardless of what the issue is or what the need is of the immigrant population, we try and address that, and we try to adapt, and we try to see it as an opportunity as opposed to it trying to affect us in a negative way. It gets especially a little bit more difficult working in this type of environment because we are a 501c3, we are a nonprofit, we don't charge any of our clients for our services. So it's a little bit difficult because we are grant funded and we are based off of fundraising and donations, and that's not a really stable source of income. But I think we contribute our success to being proactive and trying to find alternatives for more stable sources of income. One way is with media. We got a lot of media attention this summer, and we actually use that as an opportunity to really educate the community of what these issues were. The community wanted to know what's going on, why is this happening? And when we educated them and informed them of just even basic immigration law, it led to such great benefits. We quadrupled our volunteer network, we received several donations, and we are now actually in a position to be able to continue assisting this immigrant population for a significant period of time.
Oh, thank you. I'm just going to do a quick round of questions so everybody gets to know everyone a little bit, and then we'll get a little more interaction between people. One of the other discussions that we had early on was about despair and optimism, and we were all kind of in agreement that we were thrilled to be in a room full of optimistic people that were going to solve some very hard problems, and one of them that we talked about is recovery and addiction, and that's Jason's work, which has got a very different take on scale than I think we might hear in some of the other threads in this discussion.
Sure, sure. Well, first, just thank you all so much for being here. What a wonderful way to spend a Saturday morning, right? Everybody having a good day? Yes? I'm used to doing like super engaging presentations, so, engagement is always fun for me. But when it comes to looking at the different perspectives on, despair, right now we're in the middle of an opioid epidemic. And, with an opioid epidemic, so often we hear people talking about, which we take very seriously in our country, an entire plane full of people pass away every single day just from opioids alone. And, we've had leaders and friends and family members who have been directly one of those individuals. And it's not just an analogy, it's a very real thing. But at the same time, when we talk about people in long-term recovery, there's about 25 million people in recovery. And being a person in long-term recovery since November of 2007, I know that for myself and many other people, particularly early on in addiction recovery, there's kind of a saying of, one day at a time, that every day you have to choose to be in long-term recovery. And so I bring that up because when we look at the very real numbers of losing 200 people a day to just opioids alone, there's also close to 25 million Americans choosing to be in recovery every single day. And I mean, I don't, I just have an MBA, so I'm not like a super fancy PhD, math genius, but that's a pretty good number, 200 people, 25 million, I can do that math, right? But that's something that we focused on very, very early on, and one differentiator in making sure that we lift it up, because I know in the prompts that we were given as panelists is the audience really likes vulnerability and very clear action steps, right? Not just an elevator pitch. So just really clear action steps. For us, a huge differentiator was not just looking at young people in recovery back when I was actually very young, 19 or 20, not so much today, but when I was actually young, not just looking at people in long-term recovery as a special population that needed special services, which was true, but really, and this is where I get really worked up, I won't walk around the stage, I promise, but looking at people who were young and needed specific services that were, struggling with substance use disorder and mental health recovery, not just as people that needed special unicorn services, not just that we had to talk to them only on social media, but that we were also extraordinary leaders. That we didn't just need help, but if we were empowered and equipped, we could then join the solution, and there's your capacity, right? A lot of times, I fly all over the world now and talk about addiction recovery, and no one ever says, oh no, like addiction, like it's really helping our community. Everybody says it's a complete disaster and we need to figure out a way to do something, but we don't have enough resources, we don't have enough capacity. And so as a concrete consideration for your world-changing work that you're doing is when you're looking at the people that you want to impact, ask that question. Is it not only can we impact them and serve them, but can we also look at them as leadership capital and invite them to be a part of the solution and build even more innovative programs and services in their local community? That's something that when we look at despair and hope, that's kind of my excited answer.
That's great, thank you. It's a nice segue into Jamila's work and question. We were thinking about the way in which leadership models evolve in response to tensions between centralization and decentralization, and how values sometimes are a form of scaling. And so Jamila is working in nonviolent action and has some thoughts on that.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, everyone. I've been thinking about these topics for a long time, both in being the executive director of the Albert Einstein Institution and also in working with social and political movements in very difficult circumstances around the world. So thinking about centralization and decentralization and the various models that have been used historically in kind of running organizations or running movements, and sort of what do we see around the world today and how can that be made more effective? This is a big question, right? Leadership, because that's so sort of central to effectiveness. It used to be that you needed like a Mahatma Gandhi style charismatic leader like a Martin Luther King. And so when there is no Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi kind of evident in society, people think maybe change is impossible. So what we're seeing around the world is, we're more and more seeing these very decentralized models of movement building. And so, you can probably point to examples. We're talking about the global Occupy movement, the Women's March. You can see the gun rights movement, or the gun reform movement, excuse me, and around the world also with like Gezi Park protests, like the World Cup protests, Arab Spring. What the media can capture is what happens in the streets, and you see like multitudes of people, but in reality there is leadership, right? There is leadership. They may not be charismatic leadership of the style of Gandhi and King, but they definitely do exist, and they are guiding the activities of the movement. They're guiding the policies. So I think in moving forward, whether we're thinking about our organizations or our movements, decentralization is incredibly important. We may no longer need that charismatic leadership because now knowledge is also decentralized. And we all have access to the tools that can make us be effective. Now, that really hinges on the existence, the tough work of developing a collective vision. And there is required a leadership to do that. So I think that's where vision comes in. I think effectiveness is closely hinges on the existence of that collective identity and collective vision.
That's wonderful, thank you. That's really interesting. I think we'll get into that throughout the discussion. Anne Filipic is with the Obama Foundation, which everyone in Chicago, I think, is deeply curious about. But you also had a role in two different kinds of scaling, one around the community building and community action, and the other around healthcare.gov. So one was a central organization responsible to all Americans, and the other was something that was much more local and on the ground. But I'm wondering how those two models have influenced how you think about designing programs and organizations, and how you'll be applying that as the new Chief Program Officer at the Obama Foundation.
Absolutely, and good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. The mission of the Obama Foundation is to inspire, empower, and connect people to change their world, and y'all are living that on a daily basis. So it's really an honor to have the chance to be here with all of you. So thank you for being here, and more importantly, thank you for the work that you're doing. Yes, I think building on the question, my very first job out of college was I was a field organizer on an electoral campaign. I should note, by the way, as I'm sharing that, the Obama Foundation is totally nonpartisan, totally non-political. I come from a political background in the early days, but I learned a lot from that organizing experience. When I think of what organizing is at the end of the day, it's about rallying a group of people toward a common mission and developing sort of clear benchmarks and metrics that you are using to track success. And at the end of the day, isn't that what every leader of an organization is trying to do? If you are the head of a department, if you're running a small local nonprofit, if you are the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, that in so many ways, that is what we need out of our leaders. And I actually think, building upon some of what Jamila was just sharing, I think that experience as an organizer, as my first job, has really informed my sense of leadership throughout the experience of working on, yes, political campaigns, running Enroll America, which was focused on helping people enroll in health coverage, and now as I'm at the Obama Foundation. And a couple of things I would note that I think have really been formative. One is, I think, a key perspective that comes with good community organizing is the belief that the best solutions come from the community. That we are here not to find solutions for communities, we are here to find solutions with communities. And something that's been really interesting to me is to think about how that not only influences program design, but also how it influences leadership, right? And how when you are leading a team, that you are thinking about that probably the best answers are gonna come from your team members who are closest to the work. And so how do you create the space to have those conversations, to poke holes in ideas that you as the leader might have, and to think of that as not a form of weakness, but really a form of leadership. And that's been really, I think, key for me as I have been, had different leadership opportunities rooted, again, in my organizing background. The other thing that I would say that I think is connected to all of this is a willingness to let go of the reins a little bit, right? To, again, to the thinking that the best solutions come within communities, whether that community is the group of folks that you're trying to work with or the community within your organization. And I think a key thing to figure out is that doesn't mean that you are just sort of letting folks do whatever they think they want to do, right? It is actually setting, how do you set up a framework that has some clear goals, how you're tracking your progress towards those goals, but that at the end of the day, the job as a leader is to set those goals and then give folks the room to meet them. And I think the final thing I'll just note on this, as I say all of that, is I think that this form of leadership is actually very different than what our society often lifts up as strong leadership. I think we often think of strong leaders as that sort of charismatic leader who is brilliant and decrees something, and everyone is just so motivated by sort of that articulation that they just sort of fall in line. This is a very different form of leadership, right? This is the belief that that leader actually isn't the person with the answers, but that the folks that are sort of part of the community are. And I guess the final thing I'll note before handing it off is that that has been a really interesting thing for me, especially perhaps as a young woman moving through leadership roles. I'm not so young anymore, but having that opportunity is to figure out for something, a style of leadership that isn't always seen as strong leadership, how that you find your sort of authentic way of leading that is rooted in what my experience is of how you get to the best answers in a way that, that also brings with it a sense of strength. Even if that is a very different model of leadership than what we often see. So that was sort of covered a number of things, but I'd say that experience, the experiences I've had, which have been rooted in working with communities to find solutions, have absolutely informed not just how I'm thinking about program design at the Obama Foundation, but we are also really a startup organization. And as I'm thinking about building a team and thinking about culture building and the like, that these are sort of key things that I'm thinking about as well.
Well, thank you. I want to let the panel react to some of the things that they've said to you and to each other. But I did have one question I want to throw out first, which is somewhere between the communities that you're working with and the staff in the organization are networks of volunteers. And I think everybody had something to say about that, but I know Mayra was on that point earlier.
Yes, no, I think that the points expressed by the panelists are just amazing. I think strong leaders are very important, and trying to organize with limited resources is very difficult in each of our lines of work. I think the use of volunteers is underrated in a lot of fields, and I think it's something that should be definitely expanded upon. Despite, in my line of work at RAICES, it being an emotional type of work and very emotionally draining and long hours, and it's just very difficult and unpredictable, we actually have a very strong volunteer network. And it's actually been able to fill a lot of the gaps that we fill. You know, if we lose funding, we can find volunteer attorneys. We can try and find alternatives to continue the work that we do, because again, we have to continue the work in some aspect. And I think what makes our network so strong is diversifying volunteer opportunities. Most people believe that because we are a nonprofit immigration defense firm, that we only are seeking volunteers in a certain context, only attorneys, or only some type of law experience, or only if you speak another language. We don't do that. We have a wide range of volunteers. We screen each volunteer for their strengths, their skills. What can you contribute to our agency, and try and fill up that void somehow. We had, for example, we had a retired CPA, an accountant, who came to our office over the summer, who was just so moved by the events of the summer that she came. She was just like, how can I help? What can I do? I don't know anything about law, I don't speak Spanish, what can I do? And she's actually helping our accounting team and helping us, you know, process all the donations that we received. We have social workers and teachers who reach out to us begging us to help, that they can help us in any way. And they are providing support and emotional support to our staff, additional services to our clients, just really playing to the strengths of their volunteers and not necessarily us looking for one thing in particular, but really letting the community, you know, what their strengths and what they can contribute really help us. And I think that's an important thing to do, is diversify the opportunities available. And I think one important thing that we acknowledge, and I'm sure everyone would agree, is that if someone is willing to give you their time, that is something worth exploring. And don't, you know, if they don't fit in the certain criteria of a certain volunteer or idea, mindset that you have, don't roll them out right away. Take the time to know them, because they might be able to contribute to your agency in some way.
Justin, you also had some thoughts on standards for volunteers, it sounded like, and there was an internal and an external version of that. That's pretty funny.
Sure. And again, just for great comments so far, I feel like I'm in the middle of like a nonstop TED Talk. So I'm learning and trying to take notes, but I can't. Anyway, so ruthless excellence, which may sound like a really heavy term for a Saturday morning. But for me, that's, you know, that has to be there when we talk about volunteers. An organization is predominantly volunteer-led, right? So we have close to 50 chapters all over the US, and we have a very small staff team, and we have hundreds and hundreds of volunteers that then impact thousands and thousands. And so without them and any of them watching, thank you so much for everything that you're doing, because we wouldn't exist without them. And there's a very fine line, particularly when we were starting out, that, you know, there are different evolutions of leadership, right? What worked to get you to where perhaps you are today, and I learned this the hard way, may not be the thing that you need to keep doing to keep growing. So simply stated, when we started out back in really 2010 to 2013, if you could blink, you're a leader. Right? And you could just go change the world, right? And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. And at that time for us, it was unprecedented, because that meant that we grew to 125 communities almost overnight. And we had chapters and leaders and volunteers everywhere. And we thought that part of our definition of success and quantifying our impact was that how many chapters that we had, which was a strength, but then we didn't know what was even a different type of important was their impact. Because if you have 125 chapters, but only half of them do a couple of, I mean, it was this very kind of organizational crisis that we had, because we wanted to grow chapters, but then we didn't realize that it wasn't about growing chapters, it was about community impact. And so eventually we decided to go back to basics and say, you know, we don't care if we have 5 chapters. That number doesn't matter. The number of people that they're serving locally matters. But that's a big leadership decision. When, you know, part of your brand and your evolution and your momentum was built on hyper growth of chapters, and then you know, this is the internal language, which isn't so internal here when it's recorded, is part of that became, you know, we had to do a purge internally. You know, we had to say, you know what, you're out of compliance and not meeting expectations, and we lopped off close to 75 locations, but it was out of responsibility to our mission, and even more than that, responsibility to the community, especially in our line of work. If we're telling people that, you know, amidst a crisis, that you can contact us and we can help your loved one battling addiction and help them with recovery resources, and our leaders won't email you back, that's a problem. And so for us, you know, where we've landed today is high expectations, but high support, right? So if we're gonna tell people that we have high expectations to hold them to, and sometimes there's these different theories in volunteer management, but I think, you train people how to treat you. And that if you lose volunteers because they're not meeting expectations, that's okay, and that doesn't mean that they're not a good leader. It just means that maybe they're not right for that role. And that's really touchy, because sometimes people say if somebody's willing to give you their time, just get them on board and figure it out later. I think that's okay at a certain phase, but as you grow, being able to let people know that we have ridiculously high expectations because we have a responsibility, and if you can't meet them, you can't be here. And that's really scary sometimes, because you're telling that to people that are giving of their time, talent, and treasure. But I think that that's a different type of varsity level leadership, if you will. So I think it's, as leaders, you have to be brave enough to let people know that if they're not meeting expectations, they're a great person, but they're just not a good leader.
Thank you. Yeah. Jamila, how do you think about this issue of beneficiaries, participants, volunteers, and
Well, I've
leadership?
got a lot to say. That all resonated a lot, especially as we think about organizations and movements, and that movements are essentially volunteer-based. People are being asked to give of their time, to give of their energy, resources, often of their freedom, especially when you're asking people to take part at risk to themselves, especially in places where people often feel helpless. There's got to be a very compelling vision for, why there's a change possible, right? You've got to make that breakthrough to people, and I think leadership is closely linked to compelling people to act. First, a small group of volunteers, and then really growing and sustaining your movement. I think a lot of it has to do also with ownership. As leaders, or in the traditional model of leadership, we can people of authority can make people comply with certain, policies, but you can't make people trust in the vision, be dedicated, and really do what's needed to carry out policies and also sustain them. So leadership has to be redefined. I've been, my own view of leadership has been evolving a lot. I used to think that I have to know everything, so I have to read a lot of books and watch every TED Talk and talk to everyone, take notes. And then when I'm in a position where someone's, asking for some kind of guidance, that I just spit out all this content. And now I realize that that's not leadership, right? I'm not even very good at that. I think that what's really, where I can excel is enabling action in others, effective action. I think that means connecting them to each other, connecting them to resources. So, in fact, I'm basically a networker. Over 15, 16 years of doing this work, I met a lot of really amazing people who have volunteered of their time and their own networks, and that's what I do, just meet with people and connect them to other people. I think accountability is so important. I'm working with movements that are asking people, again, to take action under great risk to themselves. And so movement leaders obviously have a different level of accountability in a situation like that. We've seen movements where movement leaders are asking people to take, to go in the streets, for example, to face very, very repressive opponents day after day and sustain massive casualties, in an extreme. Let's think about it that way. Obviously, a movement leader will lose accountability when they're not providing for the needs of their people and asking them to take that high level of risk without an understanding of what is it meant to achieve. So, yeah, again, I think these issues are so central. I could go on. I'm really interested to hear from my fellow panelists about how do you balance capacity and quality. I have a lot of, so let me explain. We're such a small organization with this massive demand, and sometimes I just don't get to do the most important pieces of the work, and how, people, don't get the emails as quickly as they should, right? And I'm like constantly feeling this sense of regret about that. And so anyway, how do you guys grapple with that?
Well, one thing that I think builds upon that question and was on my mind as we were talking about volunteers is the importance of building out a model for how you're going to engage your volunteers. And I'll actually point to the Obama organizing model, which got a lot of attention in the '08 campaign. And I'll share the difference between, I shared my first job out of college was I was a field organizer. And on that campaign, I was basically spending my days, I had my list of volunteers, I'd call them and say, hey, can you come in, can you knock on doors, can you make phone calls? When they came in, I was the one that had like printed out the call list, I was the one that sat down and made sure they were trained, and they made a bunch of calls. And that certainly grew the capacity of what, if I alone was making those phone calls, I had other people helping me. The Obama organizing model, which I think was really key to the success of that campaign, was that we actually built out neighborhood teams of volunteers. So it wasn't just that a staffer had to go and build out their list of individual volunteers, but we actually built out teams and looked at what do we need to achieve, neighborhood by neighborhood, and what are the specific roles that go along with that. That often in previous campaigns, staff members would hold. So we had someone whose entire job was to print out the walk lists. We had someone whose entire job was to train a volunteer. We had someone whose entire job was to go out and recruit more volunteers. And what ended up happening was we had teams across the country who were, think about the difference between what I just described and what I said at first, right? That I, as a staffer, was calling through individual by individual to build my list of individual volunteers. And that becomes what an organizing term is a snowflake model, right? So you think of like if you are the center of the snowflake, you are building out a team that then has sort of the spokes of the snowflake growing from that, right? That they have then individual volunteers. And that is how real organizing happens, is that you have a clear model of what you need your help with, and then you empower others to do it. And that, what the key thing that you need is a model, is a framework. You can't just sort of send out an email and ask people to show up and think that will naturally happen. And so taking the time early on in your work to think about what is the model, what are we trying to achieve, and what if we spend some time early on thinking about how to empower others in doing that? How can we sort of help this take off? And I think to your question, Jamila, that's like core for me, and it's something I struggle with all the time. There's never enough hours in the day, but really to try to figure out, and again, I think you can bring this internally in an organization, what do I uniquely need to do? Like what in my role is an essential thing? And oftentimes, it's not the work itself, it is building out a framework for others to be able to achieve that.
I completely agree. I think having a structure and a model to follow and that is flexible in regarding to being adaptable for any circumstance that comes up is very key and important. Especially depending on what type of work you do, you need to have a structure and you need to have a plan and you need to have a goal. And they have to be SMART goals, right? You know, specific, measurable. You have to make sure that they're attainable, because if not, it's going to really discourage your staff, and you're not going to get to a certain level of productivity. I think one thing that I would really want to stress is, going back to your point, is how do you get everything done if you have the module without burning yourself out? That's something that any agency, regardless of what profession you're in, people struggle with. And it's something that is not really talked about, because sometimes it has a negative context, like, well, you're not being as productive enough, the model isn't correct, we have to adjust it. But it should be really talked about in a sense for prevention. How can I avoid this? What can possibly be done? What can we possibly change in order to avoid this? You know, I work in a field where burnout is common. It's one of my greatest fears as a director. It's very easy to get consumed by the work that we do and the population that we serve. But we have a role at RAICES, and it's kind of like a model of how we like to work by, and it's learn to rest before you quit. And it's something that we have to comply with, because we promote this atmosphere that, yes, this work is important and there's such a high demand and we're probably not going to get everything done today, but we need to be able to give ourselves and work in an atmosphere where that is actually understood and appreciated, and it's something that we all work on. I myself, the other day, I was meeting with a child, and their story was so emotional, and I'm an attorney, so I had to do the legal screening. I had to listen to this poor child story, and when I completed it, the child left, and I had to take a minute, I had to take a day, I had to take that moment for myself. And it doesn't negatively impact, it doesn't mean that I shouldn't be doing this work or anything. I've been doing this work for several years. It doesn't get easier. But what I have learned is not how to desynthesize, but learn to rest so I can continue, because the work is always going to continue. Immigration issues are always going to happen. They're not going to be solved in a day. So that's what I inform my staff, learn to rest before you quit. It's really an important motto, and I really respect that. And I think it's applicable to any type of field that you work in, but to give yourself that break and to know yourself and what the best work environment is for you is really key.
Sure, I used to be a youth pastor, and there was a saying that said, never quit on Monday, right? Because sometimes on a Sunday event, it didn't go the way that you wanted it to, but that's just such as life, But a few nuggets kind of related to, how the heck do you get everything done with limited time and energy? For us as an organization, and speaking especially, I think processes have been outlined really well. I mean, I think that's a very clear point, that it's not enough, there's this three-tiered thing that we double check before we kind of move forward with something, that it's okay to have the vision, you need the vision, but then you need to understand the strategy and the forces at play and to be able to scale that, but then also you have to execute. And I bring that up because sometimes people get really, I don't know if you have that friend who's like always starting a new business or a new idea or has a new idea for the program, or, before we move forward, well, what if we did it this way? And well, okay, that's great, but how does that fit into the strategy? And how can we measure that? And how can that be realistic? And how can we track that? And how can we improve that later? And then also, did you just do it? Did you start? Or are you still planning, and are you still whiteboarding? Or are you stuck in super strategic planning mode forever, and you actually haven't done the very brave and difficult thing, which is to begin that work? And so I think those three things are crucial. And then one last piece is, pretty sure, no is a complete sentence. Right? You can say no, that it may not be the right time, that if you're in a leadership role, and I loved what you said about, what are the things that only I can do? There's a few things that only I can do, and there's certainly a few things that only other positions can do, but then as an organization, if you're in a place where you realize that maybe you've grown so quickly, or even if it isn't quick growth or big, it's just like, wow, there's some momentum going, it's okay to pause. And now my personality is, it's like, we don't believe you. We don't think you ever pause, and you drink too much Red Bull. We can tell, right? But it's okay to pause, to say, you know what? We are intentionally not going to do anything new for the next month, for the next 6 months, or for a year. I went through a series in my leadership where I copy and pasted this email. It had to truly be hundreds of times in 1 year, where it said, thank you so much for reaching out. Our organization is in a season of fierce focus, and we cannot detour one iota. I have that memorized because I sent that so many times, and I can't tell you how many times actually people said, "Wow, I really respect that. Please let us know when you're out of that season, because we would really like to connect." And there were a few times when I did get an email reply once that said, "This is the most dramatic email I've ever received." And I said, "Well, I'm probably one of the most dramatic people you've ever met." But my response was actually, that was the most dramatic email I ever received. But what it represented was, we have a deep responsibility to take care of the vision that we said that we were going to accomplish, actually have a strategy that's replicable and scalable, and change when we need to. And execution doesn't just mean do, it means maybe I'm not doing other things because I said I was executing this, and I don't have time for that right now. And you can do that, and I think in the long run, people respect that, especially when you've been in growth mode and somebody really awesome reaches out and said, "We would like to do something with you," and you just say, "It's just not the right time, maybe later." Like, mad respect points, because they know that you're just not going to run around and say yes to everybody.
So we have a time for maybe one more round before we break into group discussion, but the CGIU is a place where entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs and people devoted to policy and social change come together, and very often there's an interesting cross-linkage or learning from the business community by the social and policy communities, and vice versa. Sometimes the problems that are addressed by the business community are first found in the social sector. So I wondered if the four of you could maybe discuss a little bit about how you look over the wall into the sector that you're not a part of, and what kinds of ideas and disciplines and metaphors you take from outside your world and apply them to growing and managing your organization? All right. Now, whoever wants to go.
Well, I'm not exactly shy. I'll jump in. So, when we look at, whether it's the for-profit space or different sectors, and we're, young people in recovery, the organization, it's a nonprofit, but I can tell you we have a freemium business model because we know our business model. And I know that when we talk about things like business models and cost structures and revenue streams, a few eyes glaze over. A few other people just say, clearly he got an MBA, I get it, I don't need another fancy term. But I bring those up because regardless of how, technically proficient we want to be about all of those components of a business model is, there's kind of two, non-negotiable ingredients that I believe every entity has to have regardless of value proposition or the thing that you set out to do, right? Like the really cool currency thing, right? Like I know nothing about that world, but it sounds like a genius idea. Very different than what we do, but I would assume as you talked about, like you talked a little bit about your market size, you talked about your strategy, you talked about your next steps, and regardless of if it's, exchanging foreign currency for really good causes in Chicago around the world, or you look at the addiction recovery crisis or the other issues that we represent here today, is you have to be able to communicate your plan. You have to be able to communicate those two non-negotiable ingredients, which I believe are human capital and capital. There's not you can get really far with zero resources, but you will plateau, right? You have to be able to articulate that vision, and in our experience, we had a few early wins by raising hundreds of thousands of dollars, which in the big scheme of things isn't that much money. It was a lot of money when we were just making everything up as we went, and it gave us our start. But eventually, then people really said, you've smiled, your way through a few $1 million now. You need to give us the change the world plan. And that means we know what we need to know, and you have to answer, what will you do with $1 million, $2 million, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth. And you have to have a better answer than just charismatic leadership and hope. You need to tell us, essentially what your cap table would look like, and with different amounts of money, how would you scale? Because we need to know that for $80,000, we're going to impact this community in this many ways, and not just how many people we're going to impact, but how are you going to impact that person specifically. So for us, in closing, was how much does it cost to put up a chapter? What will the impact of that chapter be? Then the people that you serve in that chapter, 3, 6, 18, 2 years, down the road, how will you impact them? And that's what we call a recovery capital index, a way in which to measure how much someone is in recovery. And those are all things that way back in the day, like 2010 for me, when we said, well, we just want to empower people in recovery, we weren't necessarily talking about, capital inputs for, program outputs, but those are things, regardless of the jargon, you have to be able to tell people what you're going to do with money. And generally speaking, with more money, you can help more people if you're running a tight organization.
Getting that point of dollars per X, figuring out what the X is often really a challenge. Should anybody else have a quick response?
Yeah, I think one thing that we are exploring right now and thinking a lot about is matters of monitoring and evaluation in an organization. And I think looking at different models that are out there, I think for the social sector space in general, I think the question of how we bring in different approaches to, I think you've heard a consistent theme here, right? That you need to have a framework, you need to have clear goals, you need to figure out how you're going to meet them. And there's a lot in the for-profit space, OKRs, objectives and key results, KPIs, key performance indicators, and thinking about how we should be bringing those into the social sector because we need clear goals, but also understanding that sometimes the challenges that we're trying to solve are really nuanced, complicated, and the solutions are not always easily quantifiable. And that, I think, is a really big challenge for the space generally, of figuring out, and I think throughout in a lot of different efforts in recent years, there's sort of been this question of what should the role that data plays versus the role of sort of the heart, right? And sort of that feeling of connection. And I think it's a really big question for all of us, and figuring out how to bring in the best from different fields to have clear ways to measure progress, even if it is not ultimately success. I think for a lot of this work, we're not trying to make the end success. I mean, we want to get there, but the reality is it's really about day by day, year by year progress. And I think that's just a big question for all of us, something I'm thinking a lot about. Coming from, as I said, I did some electoral work where success is very clear. I did work enrolling Americans in health coverage where progress was really clear. And now the work that is really about building the civic society of tomorrow and how do we empower leaders in the skills, mindsets, abilities that we all need to be able to do that. That's harder to measure, right? That's harder to figure out beyond outputs, like how many people are going through programming, but actually the results that are happening in communities because of it. And I think figuring out how to measure without sort of losing the heart of what we're really trying to do and recognizing that sometimes the greatest progress will be made in things that that don't have numbers attached to it. And that is a really big question and something the things that sort of keep me up at night, that's one that I'm absolutely wrestling with.
So when this session was planned, the idea was that we were going to have peer group discussions and we were going to break up into smaller groups and people in the audience could meet each other and describe some of the problems that they're facing and some of the solutions that they're thinking about with respect to scale and organizational growth. The room does look a little tight to me, but I think that if we can huddle in faraway corners, hopefully the noise floor will not raise to the point that we can only have conversations between pairs. But if we can break into groups of 10 to 15 for 15 minutes, and then we'll have a round where people can report back on some of the questions. Is that something that everybody's willing to give a try? Is that,
They look willing and able. You got it.
yeah, I think so. But there is space further back and upstairs. So if we all speak quietly, we can all hear our group. Yeah, and we'll reconvene for questions when you're done. Okay, so the iron law of a good conference is if the hallway conversations and the people to your left and right are more interesting than the people on the stage.
It's true.
That's a metric. And I think this conference is off the scale for that, looking at the conversations that I saw going on between people. So I hope you got a sense of your peers and some shared interests that you can follow up later, and maybe some questions that can illuminate or stump the panelists and the audience. So I see the first question there ready to go.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Shangdi. I'm from UC San Diego, and I'm here to represent my commitment to action called Move Around the World. So I'm a dancer myself, and what I want to do is expand the definition and the utilize of dance. So in our program, you use dance to promote cultural understanding in higher education institutions. So and my question is, well, okay, recently we went through a leadership change, and we also developing a pipeline, a new structure for volunteers, because when we find out that it was really hard for us to retain volunteers because everybody kind of gets scared by the idea of dance, and we didn't really have a training progress. But that's something that we're working on. And my question is, so I will be graduating in 6 months. So that means we will go through another leadership change in the 6 months. And what I found very difficult is that as of right now, I'm very worried about the survival of our work. And if I dig a little bit deep down into myself, even though it's a little bit embarrassing to admit, but I think it comes down to me not having enough trust in my member. Because what often happens is that we'll have assigned task, and then at the last minute, I'll be like, oh, you're busy, don't worry, I'll do it. So I'm kind of burning out myself in the past year or so. But I don't think that's a very sustainable model. It's not healthy at all, because it ended up being me like running 100 miles per hour where everybody have the passion, but are just kind of confused standing around. So I have to critique myself first, but then I don't really know how to build trust, because a little bit perfectionist in me, I feel so hard to let go to see something like, you know what I mean? Like. So
you've got two really hard problems. One is succession and the other is delegation.
Yes,
Neither
I'm working on myself, so.
Does anyone on the panel have some thoughts on that to share with the audience?
We sympathize.
Yes.
Yeah, I worked for 15 years with Gene Sharp, who is the founder of the field of civil resistance, someone with extremely high standards, and who, you know, so I understand some of the issues you talked about. I don't have a good answer. I think that the future of your organization, of the sustainability of your organization, absolutely depends on you bringing in new people that you can mentor, and understanding that they're not going to do things exactly as you do them, but that they may have their own contributions to make. And I think having a strong organizational culture and vision can help to, you know, reduce the possibility that people are going to go way off, you know, that they're going to mainly do something that is in the collective best interest of your organization or your, whether it's your organization or a movement. So yeah, it sounds like classic founder syndrome. And, you know, maybe that's something we can learn from the corporations, from the business world, about how that's managed.
I would just like to add just a quick tip that I learned. I'm very similar. I am a type A personality. I have to have everything organized, which is really hard to do in this field. One technique that I learned in regards to delegation, and maybe it will work for you too, is I want to be involved in everything. I'm a director, I'm an attorney. I still want to go to the detention facilities and talk to kids directly. I somehow make it work for my schedule because I need that to continue. But in order for me to have make that time, I have to be able to delegate certain things. So what I started doing was I was realizing, hey, what if I don't complete something today? Is it going to be the end of the world, right? You know, can someone else do this? And I started to see a pattern on certain things that didn't necessarily I had to complete that day, and I slowly started developing a list of things that I could delegate to an associate program director or another attorney. And so, I know we all agree in the same thing in developing that trust in your staff, but just a small tip is just, it seems so cliche, but delegation is really key. And you really, a tip that I did is just really like, okay, I need to do this in order for me to be sane. This is what I need to do for my job to continue. And you know, all these other factors, I don't necessarily have to do myself, so let me start outsourcing those types of things.
And I'll just add on the point of delegation. I think for a lot of us, it's like, we know we need to delegate, but what is that, like, how do you do that successfully and lead to strong results, right? And I think a couple of things I'll just say is, one, really getting very clear for yourself and with your team of what success looks like, not just big picture, but for a given project. And I think often when we haven't taken the time to articulate that, we fall into a place where we're judging, are they doing it the way I would do it? Which is different than, is this going to be successful, right? And the problem is, if you haven't defined what success looks like, then you don't have something to judge against, right? So that's a really key thing to articulate for yourself, is the first thing, because I think sometimes even we as leaders haven't taken the time to pause and think about that, and then to be able to articulate that. And then I would add, and again, sort of going back to some of my sort of organizing experiences, is actually once you've articulated that, you are right, by the way, to name like this secession as like a really critical moment for the organization. I think a lot of organizations actually do falter because you haven't gotten the right person to succeed. Succeed you. And I'd say a key part there is intentionally create what are almost like little tests, right? Of like projects that you can hand off to different members of your team, being very clear about what success looks like, and then see how they succeed. This is something that happens on like organizing campaigns, is you do a dry run the week before election day. That is to get everybody practiced up, but also you see who didn't succeed, right? And you know that you need to replace that volunteer or that person. And so I think thinking about what are the dry runs that you can put in place that are sort of simulating the kind of leadership that you would need for this person, and see who's able to, once you've articulated success, ultimately achieve in it.
I'm going to jump us over to the next question because I think there's some others in the queue.
Hi, my name is Dana English. I'm from the University of Arkansas, and my commitment to action is creating a financial literacy program for college students in order to close the wealth inequality gap. We're specifically focused on investments, and one of the things I'm very concerned about is creating a stream of income for my organization. We're concerned that if we're just relying off of grants and donations, that in the off year something may happen and then we don't have the resources that we need to train people to get out curriculum. And I was wondering, how do you guys work with that in your organizations, dealing with loss of funds or securing those funds to keep your organizations going?
Anyone want to take that? I think it is nice to have a broad base of donors, but beyond that,
That's exactly the field of work that I'm in. We are completely grant-based, and like I mentioned before, grants can be lost at any day. And I think what we've done is you cannot settle. You have to keep looking for alternatives and more stable sources, and a consistent list of donors is great, but sometimes, if you don't produce certain results, they're not going to continue donating. So just looking for alternatives, looking for different types of services. There was a point in our job where, we didn't know if we could continue one legal aspect, so we actually expanded to social services, and being diverse in not only our funding sources, but in the products and outputs that we do is really helpful. And then just, it seems, again, a cliche, but you have to have an emergency plan if that happens. I clearly remember there was one time before all the fundraising that we received, we had a sit-down conversation with our executive director, and there was a fear that we were going to lose our largest grant, and we had a 6-month wind-down plan. We did. You have to have that. You have to plan for worst-case scenario. Luckily, we didn't have to use it, but you have to be realistic on the business side of it. You have to have backups to those types of things. You have to be, have an open discussion about that within your leadership team to be able to really continue. So just really being open, looking for more opportunities, diversifying those opportunities are really important.
I'll just add quickly, my role before being at the Obama Foundation, I ran a nonprofit called Enroll America, and I came in as president having done no fundraising and knowing that that was one of the essential pieces I would need to do. Ultimately, we were able to raise over $60 million in 4 years. But this was probably what I was most anxious about. And the key for me, how many times can I allude back to lessons from organizing, but where it worked for me was understanding that fundraising is organizing, and a key piece of this is approaching a funder thinking not just what are you trying to achieve, what do you need from this, but ultimately what are they trying to achieve? Right? And that's true of partnership approaches, that's true with your volunteers, that's true with anyone you're trying to work with, is to understand, I think good organizing is understanding that everyone operates out of self-interest. That is not selfishness, right? Self-interest is that we're all here because we're trying to achieve something. Helping a community can be what you're trying to achieve, right? But understanding that exactly what you're trying to achieve might be different than what they're trying to achieve, but that doesn't mean that there aren't concentric circles here. And so approaching a funder by first, before you go in there, thinking about why did they even take this meeting? Might they be interested in? And making sure that you're crafting your pitch in the view of what they might be interested in, not just what you're interested in. And that means that every pitch may look a little bit different. I will also say that does not mean that you're just sort of jumping all over the place and losing who you are, right, and what you're here to do. You're not just chasing dollars, but being able to marry those things, to talk about what you are doing in an authentic way, and also understanding what might be bringing them to the conversation makes you that much more effective in not just bringing the dollars in, but really expanding the circle. And if you think about it that way, you could be approaching folks that maybe aren't traditional funders, but you see a path of why there may be interest in what you're trying to achieve.
okay, we're going to sneak in one last question. We'll probably go over time with the answer, but the question's ready to go.
Hi, my name's Abel at Roosevelt University, and Justin alluded to this earlier in the panel about execution, and one of the things that I find that I struggle with is actually having the soft opens for your project is the easy part, and finding that there's these little tweaks that you can make, and sometimes it may seem little to everyone else, but you, because it's your brainchild, you see it as a glaring mistake and can always make this project better and improve upon it. What suggestions would you say of kind of getting over that fear to fully jump in and say, all right, we're going to do it, and then if something happens, we're going to move along with it and tweak this project as much as we can after it's just jumping into it.
I'll speak to that quickly, and then maybe if I have enough time, I'll hit the other ones quickly as well. But leaders exist to solve problems. So trying to lead an environment where it is supposed to be a mistake-free environment just isn't realistic, right? If we knew everything, then why is our organization here? Why is our team here? That, we often say all the time, well, this is why we have jobs, right? And I understand that not everybody gets, I volunteered for years before I ever even got paid anything, young people in recovery. But today, because I get to work there, it's, well, this is why I have a job. My job is to solve problems. So now the difference is maybe how do we solve new problems, and how do we create a way to where we can have an accountability mechanism or a dry run built in, or if I'm doing succession planning, how can I make sure that let somebody run a meeting, let somebody else make the agenda, and you can still sit there and you can jump in. Kind of that pivot phrase for us is, you can let somebody fail, but don't let them fall, right? That give them something that they could fail at, that it's okay, but don't let them fall. And it's very difficult to do that on, during your last week if you're leaving somewhere, right? To build in all those processes. So start doing it early. And, I usually open up most large events, internally with the organization as announcing that I'm leaving, because people know that one day I'll be leaving the organization. And so that's the type of mindset that we want to have as a culture, not because we have this unhealthy, like he's quitting any day now. It's not supposed to be a fear factor. It's supposed to be a realization of we exist to solve problems, it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to learn how to delegate, and we can have a safe space to allow people to try on those new leadership roles. And then lastly, about monetizing things upstream. If you're looking at diversifying revenue streams, if you're running into a roadblock of raising that next 60 million bucks or your first 600 bucks, whatever that may be, is we found great success in kind of monetizing what we do upstream on a recurring revenue basis. So for us, instead of just creating a community-based program and delivering services in partnership with a healthcare system, is actually going to the healthcare system and saying, actually, can we structure a deal to where you'll pay us on a recurring revenue basis so we can provide the service, in perpetuity, if you will.
Great. Well, thank you. We are at time. Panelists have said that they will hang around. So we'll look forward to seeing you in the halls. And thank you again for coming out on Saturday morning. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Okay.